The scream tore through the afternoon silence of Rico, Colorado, sharp enough to send every head on Main Street turning toward the boarding house, and Donovan O'Brien dropped the saddle he'd been loading onto his horse to sprint toward the sound without a second thought. He burst through the doorway of the boarding house just as smoke began billowing from the kitchen, thick and acrid, burning his lungs as he pushed through. Inside, a woman stood frozen near the stove, her hands held out in front of her, her face twisted in agony. The cast iron skillet lay overturned on the floor, oil still sizzling and smoking where it had splattered across the wooden planks. Flames licked up the kitchen curtains, and Donovan grabbed the water bucket by the door, dousing them before they could spread further. "Your hands," he said, moving toward her quickly. "Let me see them." She was shaking, her whole body trembling as she finally looked up at him with wide, terrified eyes. Her hands were angry red, already beginning to blister across the palms and fingers. She tried to speak, but only a sob came out. "I know it hurts," Donovan said, keeping his voice steady and calm despite the way his heart hammered against his ribs. "But we need to get you help right now. Can you walk?" She nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks, and he guided her carefully out of the smoke-filled kitchen and into the main room of the boarding house. Other residents had gathered, their faces pale with concern, and Mrs. Henderson, the owner, came rushing over with her apron still flour-dusted. "Good Lord, Josephine!" Mrs. Henderson gasped. "What happened?" "The oil caught fire," Josephine managed to say through gritted teeth. "I tried to move the pan, but it spilled all over my hands." Donovan was already assessing the situation, his mind working through what needed to be done. He'd seen burns before, bad ones from branding irons and campfires gone wrong during cattle drives. Burns could turn dangerous fast if they weren't tended properly. "Mrs. Henderson, do you have any clean cloth? Plenty of it? And I'll need cool water, not cold. And if you've got any honey or lard, bring that too." The older woman nodded and hurried off while Donovan carefully led Josephine to a chair. He pulled another chair close and sat facing her, his knees almost touching hers. "I need to look at them properly," he said gently. "I promise I'll be as careful as I can." Josephine held her hands out, and even in the better light, Donovan could see how severe the burns were. The skin was bright red, and already forming fluid-filled blisters across both palms and several fingers. She must have grabbed the handle of the pan instinctively when the oil ignited. "I'm Donovan O'Brien," he said, trying to distract her from the pain. "I'd just got into town yesterday, was planning to head up to the mines for work." "Josephine Darrow," she whispered. "I've been staying here 3 months now. I work at the general store." Mrs. Henderson returned with an armful of clean white cloth torn into strips, a basin of water, and a small jar of honey. Donovan nodded his thanks and dipped one of the cloths into the water, wringing it out so it was damp but not dripping. "This is going to hurt," he warned, "but we need to cool the burns down and keep them clean. If we don't, infection will set in, and that's worse than anything." Josephine bit her lip and nodded, squeezing her eyes shut. Donovan worked with painstaking care, dabbing the cool cloth against her burned palms. She gasped, and fresh tears rolled down her cheeks, but she didn't pull away. He took his time, cooling the angry skin, watching as some of the immediate redness began to fade slightly. "You're doing real good," he murmured. "I know it hurts something fierce." "Where did you learn to do this?" Josephine asked, her voice strained. "Spent the last 8 years working cattle drives from Texas up to Montana," Donovan replied, keeping his hands steady as he worked. "You see all kinds of injuries out on the trail, burns, breaks, snake bites. You learn fast or people die. Had a good trail boss who made sure we all knew basic doctoring." He applied a thin layer of honey to the burns once he'd cooled them sufficiently. The honey would help prevent infection and keep the wounds from drying out too badly. Then he began the careful process of wrapping her hands, making sure the bandages were secure but not so tight they'd cut off circulation. "You won't be able to use these hands for a good while," Donovan said as he tied off the final bandage. "Couple of weeks at least, maybe more depending on how they heal. You need to keep them clean and dry, change the bandages twice a day, and whatever you do, don't try to use them for anything." Josephine stared down at her wrapped hands, and her face crumpled. I can't work like this. Mr. Peterson at the general store, he'll have to let me go. And I need to pay Mrs. Henderson for my room and board. I don't have family here. I don't have anyone who can help me. The desperation in her voice cut through Donovan like a knife. He'd seen that same look on the faces of people who'd lost everything to drought or disease. That terrible realization that survival had just become a lot more complicated. When's the last time you ate? He asked. She blinked at the sudden change of subject. I was making lunch when the fire started. I haven't eaten since breakfast. Donovan stood and looked at Mrs. Henderson. Your kitchen still usable after I put out those flames? Should be, Mrs. Henderson said. Might smell like smoke for a day or two, but nothing's damaged besides the curtains. Good. Miss Darrow here needs to eat, and I suspect she won't be able to manage it on her own with those hands. He looked back at Josephine. I can cook, not fancy, but filling and tasty enough. Will you let me make you something? Josephine looked startled, and then embarrassed color rose in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the burns. You don't have to do that. You've already done so much. Maybe so, but I'm offering anyway. You need to eat to heal, and you need to keep your strength up. He gave her a slight smile. Besides, I'm hungry too, and Mrs. Henderson looks like she could use a meal that she doesn't have to cook herself. Mrs. Henderson laughed at that, some of the tension breaking. You won't hear me arguing, Mr. O'Brien. The kitchen's yours if you want it. Donovan headed into the kitchen and opened the window to let out the remaining smoke before surveying what he had to work with. The boarding house kitchen was better stocked than most trail camps, that was certain. He found potatoes, onions, and salt pork, along with flour and eggs. That would do just fine. He got to work, moving with the efficient economy of someone who'd cooked over campfires in rain and wind. He sliced the salt pork and got it sizzling in a clean skillet, then diced the potatoes and onions to add once the pork had rendered some of its fat. The familiar motions were soothing, and he found himself relaxing into the work. Through the doorway, he could see Josephine still sitting where he'd left her, talking quietly with Mrs. Henderson. In the better light of the main room, with her face not twisted in pain, he could see that she was quite beautiful. She had rich brown hair that she'd pinned up in a simple style, though several strands had come loose and hung around her face. Her eyes were a warm hazel, and even red from crying. They had an intelligence and determination to them that he recognized. The food was ready within the hour. He'd made plenty, enough for Josephine, Mrs. Henderson, and himself, with extra for anyone else in the boarding house who wanted some. He plated up 3 portions and brought them out on a tray. Smells wonderful, Mrs. Henderson said appreciatively. Been a long time since a man cooked in my kitchen. Donovan set the plates down and then turned his attention to Josephine. Now, you're going to need help eating, at least for today. Tomorrow we can see about you managing some things on your own, but those burns are too fresh right now. I can't ask you to feed me, Josephine protested, her cheeks flushing darker. That's too much. You're not asking, I'm offering. There's a difference. Donovan pulled his chair close again and picked up the fork. Now, I promise my hands are clean, and I'll be as dignified about this as possible. But you need to eat, Miss Darrow. She looked like she wanted to argue more, but her stomach chose that moment to growl audibly, and she laughed despite herself. All right, thank you, Mr. O'Brien. I truly don't know what I would have done if you hadn't been there. Call me Donovan, he said, spearing a piece of potato and bringing it to her lips. And you don't need to thank me, just doing what any decent person would do. They fell into a rhythm. Donovan would take a bite of his own food, then offer a bite to Josephine, then eat another bite himself. It was strangely intimate watching her eat, seeing the relief in her face as the food began to settle the shock in her system. She had a lovely smile, he realized, when the pain and fear faded from her expression. This is really good, she said after a few minutes. Where did you learn to cook like this? Trail cooking mostly, Donovan replied. When you're working cattle, everyone takes a turn at the chuck wagon. I found I had a knack for it. The cook on my first drive taught me a lot of basics, and I picked up the rest as I went along. "Why did you decide to come to Rico?" Josephine asked. "Not many people come here anymore, not since the silver prices dropped." Donovan shrugged. "I was ready for a change from the cattle drives. Thought mining work might be steadier, even if the silver boom is mostly over. Still enough operations running that they need workers. Plus, I've always liked the mountains. Something peaceful about them." "I came here because I needed to start over," Josephine said quietly. "My parents died of influenza 2 years ago back in Kansas. After that, everything fell apart. I lost the farm to debts I didn't even know existed. I had a little money saved, enough to get me here and pay for a room while I found work. Mr. Peterson hired me at the general store. And I've been trying to save up enough to maybe open my own dress shop someday. I'm good with a needle. And there aren't many options for women here when it comes to buying nice clothing." "That's a good dream," Donovan said. "You shouldn't have to give that up because of this accident." "I don't see how I have much choice now," Josephine replied, looking down at her bandaged hands. "I won't be able to work for weeks, maybe a month or more. Even if Mr. Peterson is understanding, I still need to pay rent and buy food. My savings won't last long." An idea had been forming in Donovan's mind as they talked, crystallizing into something that felt right. He'd come to Rico without any particular plan beyond finding work. The mining companies wouldn't care if he started tomorrow or next week. And something about Josephine Darrow called to him, made him want to help her in a way that went beyond just bandaging her burns. "What if I stayed and helped you, Ree?" he asked. "Just until your hands heal enough that you can manage on your own. I can cook for you, help you with whatever daily tasks you need doing. I was planning to find a room anyway, and Mrs. Henderson's rates are fair. I've got money saved from the last cattle drive. I can afford to wait a few weeks before I start at the mines." Josephine stared at him, her eyes wide. "You can't be serious. You don't even know me. Why would you do that?" "Because you need help, and I'm in a position to give it," Donovan said simply. "And maybe because I'd like to get to know you better if you'll let me." The words hung in the air between them, honest and straightforward. Donovan wasn't a man who played games or spoke in riddles. He said what he meant and meant what he said. And right now he meant that he wanted to spend more time with this brave woman who was trying not to cry, even though he could see the pain still written across her face. "I don't know what to say," Josephine whispered. "Say yes," Mrs. Henderson interjected from across the table. "Forgive an old woman for listening in, but Mr. O'Brien is right. You need help, Josephine, and you're in no position to be too proud about accepting it. From what I've seen in the last hour, he's a good man with a kind heart. Let him do this." Josephine looked between them, and then she nodded slowly. "Yes, thank you, Donovan. I accept your help." Relief flooded through Donovan, though he wasn't entirely sure why her answer mattered so much to him. He'd known this woman for less than 2 hours, but something about her resonated with him on a level he couldn't quite explain. "Good, means, Keen," he said. "Then it's settled. Now finish eating and then you should rest. Burns take a lot out of a person." They finished the meal in companionable silence, and Donovan helped Josephine to her room on the second floor. It was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a trunk for her belongings. He made sure she had everything she needed within easy reach and promised to check on her in a few hours. Then he went back downstairs to talk to Mrs. Henderson about getting a room for himself and to clean up the kitchen properly. As he washed the dishes and put everything away, he found himself thinking about Josephine's smile, about the courage it must have taken for her to come all the way to Colorado alone after losing everything. She was strong, maybe stronger than she realized. The next morning, Donovan woke early and made his way down to the kitchen. He built up the fire in the stove and started coffee before beginning work on breakfast. He made flapjacks and bacon, scrambled eggs with cheese, and fried up some of the leftover potatoes from dinner. The boarding house began to fill with the smells of cooking, and soon other residents were drifting into the dining room with appreciative murmurs. Mrs. Henderson appeared with Josephine, who looked exhausted but better than she had the day before. The terror had faded from her eyes, replaced by a quiet determination that Donovan recognized and admired. "How are your hands this morning?" he asked, as he guided her to a seat. "They hurt," she admitted. "I couldn't sleep much. Every time I moved them, the pain would wake me up." That's normal for burns this bad, Donovan said. It'll get better over the next few days as the initial trauma settles. We'll need to change those bandages after breakfast, though. Make sure everything's healing clean. He brought her a plate and sat down to help her eat again. It was easier this morning, less awkward, and Josephine even laughed when he accidentally brought the fork up too fast and nearly poked her in the nose. Sorry, Donovan said, grinning. My aim's better with a lasso. I'll have to take your word on that, Josephine replied, her eyes sparkling with humor despite the pain he knew she was in. After breakfast, Donovan carefully unwrapped the bandages from her hands. The burns looked about as he'd expected, angry and painful, but not infected. He cleaned them again with cool water, applied fresh honey, and rewrapped them with clean cloth. You're very good at this, Josephine observed, watching him work. I've had practice, Donovan said. Too much practice, honestly. I'd be happy never to bandage another burn or set another broken bone. Did you ever think about becoming a doctor? Donovan shook his head. No, I'm too restless for that. I like being outdoors, working with my hands, moving around. Doctoring is important work, but it's not for me. What is for you? Josephine asked. I mean, what do you want from life? It was a bigger question than she probably realized, and Donovan took his time answering as he finished tying off the bandages. I want land of my own someday, he said finally. Not a lot, just enough for some cattle and maybe a few horses. A place where I can build a house and know that it's mine, that nobody can take it away. I spent my childhood moving from place to place because my father could never hold down steady work. I want roots, stability, a home. That sounds wonderful, Josephine said softly. I want something similar, not land necessarily, but a business of my own, something I built with my own hands that can't be taken away because of someone else's debts or decisions. Then we'll both have to make sure we get what we want, Donovan said, meeting her eyes. And right now, that means taking care of you so you can heal and get back to saving for that dress shop. Over the following days, they fell into a routine. Donovan cooked every meal, not just for Josephine, but for the entire boarding house. Mrs. Henderson insisted on reducing his room rate in exchange for the cooking, and several of the other residents chipped in with coin as well, grateful for the good food. Donovan helped Josephine with everything she couldn't manage on her own, with her bandaged hands, from getting dressed to washing her face to brushing her hair. That last task became his favorite part of the day. Each evening, he would sit behind Josephine in her room with the door propped open for propriety and carefully brush out her long brown hair. She would tell him about her day, about the books she was reading or the dreams she had for her dress shop, and he would tell her stories from his years on the cattle drives. Did you ever see any real outlaws? Josephine asked one evening as Donovan worked through a tangle in her hair. A few times, Donovan replied. Mostly they left us alone. Cattle drives are too big and too well armed to be worth the trouble. But once, when I was 19, we got hit by a group trying to steal horses. They picked the wrong outfit. Our trail boss, man named Samuel Grant, he could shoot the eye out of a rattlesnake at 50 paces, ran those outlaws off before they could take a single animal. Were you scared? Terrified, Donovan admitted. But everyone was counting on me to do my part, so I did. That's what you do when you're part of a crew. You stand together. I wish I'd had that, Josephine said quietly. When my parents died, I was alone. All our neighbors had their own problems, and nobody had the means to help even if they'd wanted to. I had to figure everything out by myself, and I made mistakes. Lost the farm because I didn't understand the legal papers I was signing. Trusted the wrong lawyer who was more interested in his fee than in helping me. By the time I realized what was happening, it was too late. Donovan's hands stilled in her hair. That wasn't your fault. People took advantage of you when you were grieving and vulnerable. That says something about their character, not yours. Maybe, Josephine said, but I still lost everything. You didn't lose everything, Donovan countered. You still have yourself. Your strength, your intelligence, your dreams, those can't be taken away unless you let them. And from what I've seen, you're not the kind of woman who gives up easily. Josephine turned to look at him, and the expression on her face made something warm unfold in Donovan's chest. Thank you, she said, for saying that. And for everything else you've done. I don't think I've properly expressed how grateful I am. You don't need to be grateful, Donovan said. I'm glad to help. More than glad. Honestly. These past few days have been the happiest I've had in a long time. The words were out before he could stop them, more honest than he'd intended, and he saw Josephine's eyes widen slightly. But she didn't pull away or look uncomfortable. Instead, she smiled, and it was like the sun coming out from behind clouds. They've been happy for me too, she said softly. Even with the pain and the worry, knowing you're here has made everything easier to bear. They stayed there for a moment, just looking at each other, and Donovan felt the shift between them like a physical thing. This was becoming something more than just him helping a stranger. This was the beginning of something real and profound, something that scared him as much as it thrilled him. By the end of the first week, Josephine's burns had healed enough that she could start doing small tasks on her own. She could hold a book to read, could manage eating with a fork if Donovan cut her food into small pieces first. She still couldn't do anything that required gripping or pressure, but it was progress. Donovan went with her when she walked to the general store to talk to Mr. Peterson. The store owner was a middle-aged man with a kind face and an understanding demeanor. "I'm sorry, Josephine," Mr. Peterson said when she explained the situation, "but I can't hold your position for weeks. I need someone who can work now. I've already hired Sally Miller to take your place." Josephine's face fell, but she nodded with dignity. "I understand, Mr. Peterson. Thank you for the opportunity you gave me." Outside the store, Donovan watched her blink back tears and felt his heart ache for her. "We'll figure something out," he said. "You're not going to lose everything again. I promise you that." "You can't promise that," Josephine said, but without heat. She just sounded tired. "You're being wonderful, Donovan, but you can't fix everything. Eventually, you'll need to start your own work at the mines, and I'll need to find a way to pay my rent and buy food. And right now, I don't see how that's going to happen." Donovan took a breath, and then he made a decision that he knew would change everything. "Marry me." Josephine stopped walking and stared at him like he'd lost his mind. "What?" "Marry me," Donovan repeated. "I know it's fast. I know we've only known each other a week, but I think this could work. I care about you, Josephine, more than I've cared about anyone in a long time. And I think you might feel something for me too. If we get married, I can take care of you properly while your hands heal. Then, when you're ready, we can both work toward our dreams together. You can save for your dress shop. I can save for land. We'll be partners." "That's insane," Josephine said, but her voice was shaking. "People don't just marry someone they've known for a week." "People in the West do it all the time," Donovan countered. "Mail-order brides marry men they've never even met. At least we know each other. We've spent every day together for a week, and I've seen who you are when you're vulnerable and hurting. You've seen me the same way. That's more than a lot of married couples have when they start out." "But what if it doesn't work?" Josephine asked. "What if we're making a terrible mistake?" "What if we're not?" Donovan replied. He took her bandaged hands carefully in his. "What if this is exactly what we're both supposed to do? I can't promise everything will be perfect, but I can promise I'll work hard to make you happy. I'll be faithful and honest and do my best to be a good husband. That's all I can offer, but I'm offering it sincerely." Josephine looked down at their joined hands, and Donovan could see the conflict playing across her face. Fear and hope warring with each other. Practicality fighting against something deeper and more primal. "I care about you too," she finally whispered. "More than I should after such a short time. When you're near me, I feel safe in a way I haven't felt since before my parents died. And when I imagine you leaving to work at the mines, when I think about not seeing you every day, it hurts in a way that has nothing to do with my burns." "Then say yes," Donovan urged. "Take a chance on this, on us. I know it's a risk, but the best things in life usually are." Josephine looked up at him, and in her hazel eyes he saw the moment she made her decision. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Donovan O'Brien, I'll marry you." Joy surged through Donovan, so intense it nearly staggered him. He wanted to sweep her into his arms and spin her around, but her hands were still healing, so instead he leaned down and kissed her forehead gently, reverently, like she was something precious that might break. "You won't regret this," he promised. "I'll spend the rest of my life making sure you don't regret this." They were married 3 days later by the circuit preacher, who happened to be passing through Rico. Mrs. Henderson cried happy tears and insisted on making a cake, despite Donovan's protests that he could bake. The other boarding house residents attended, along with a few people from town who'd heard about the wedding and wanted to witness it. Josephine wore a simple blue dress that she'd owned since Kansas, and Donovan wore his best shirt and pants, cleaned and pressed for the occasion. They stood in the boarding house parlor and said their vows, and when the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Donovan kissed his new bride carefully, mindful of her still healing hands but unable to hide the depth of his feelings. That night, in the larger room that Mrs. Henderson had given them as a wedding present of sorts, Donovan and Josephine lay together in the darkness and talked about their future. "I'm scared," Josephine admitted, her head resting on Donovan's shoulder. "What if I'm not a good wife? What if I don't know how to make this work?" "Then we'll figure it out together," Donovan replied, running his fingers gently through her hair. "Marriage is work, I know that. But I'm not afraid of hard work, and I don't think you are either. We'll have disagreements and difficult days, but we'll face them as a team." "I've never been anyone's wife before," Josephine said. "I don't know what you expect from me." "I expect you to be yourself," Donovan said. "That's all. Be honest with me. Talk to me when something's bothering you, and let me do the same. Everything else, we'll work out as we go." They made love for the first time that night, carefully because of Josephine's hands, but with a tenderness and passion that left them both shaken. Afterward, Josephine cried, and Donovan held her close, understanding that the tears were about more than just physical intimacy. They were about trust and vulnerability, about allowing herself to hope again after so much loss. "I love you," she whispered into the darkness. "I know it's too soon to say that, but I do. I love you, Donovan." "It's not too soon," Donovan replied, his voice rough with emotion. "And I love you too. I think I started falling in love with you the moment I saw you standing there with your burned hands trying so hard to be brave." The next few weeks passed in a haze of happiness and growing comfort. Josephine's hands continued to heal, the angry red fading to pink, and then to pale new skin. The blisters dried up and flaked away, and while her palms remained tender and sensitive, she gradually regained the ability to use them for simple tasks. Donovan started work at one of the smaller mining operations outside of town, a silver mine that was still producing enough to keep a crew of 15 men employed. The work was hard and dirty, but the pay was steady, and he came home each evening to a wife who greeted him with a smile that made every aching muscle worthwhile. In turn, Josephine took over more of the cooking and housework as her hands allowed. She was a good cook in her own right, he discovered, with a talent for baking that surpassed his own. Her bread was lighter and more flavorful than anything he'd managed on the trail, and her pies became legendary among the boarding house residents. "You should sell these," Donovan said one evening, savoring a slice of apple pie that tasted like heaven. "People would pay good money for pies this good." Josephine looked thoughtful. "I hadn't considered that, but you might be right. It would be a way to start earning money again while I save for the dress shop. I could bake pies and sell them to the restaurant and the saloon, maybe take special orders for events." "Let's do it," Donovan encouraged. "I'll help you get set up. We can use some of my wages to buy the supplies you need to get started." Within a month, Josephine had a thriving pie business. Word spread quickly about her baking skills, and soon she was turning out a dozen pies a week, selling them for $1 each. It wasn't a fortune, but it was income, and more importantly, it was hers. Donovan could see the pride and confidence growing in her with each pie she made, each customer who came back for more. They saved carefully, both of them working toward their dreams. Donovan's wages from the mine went toward food and rent and the fund for his future land purchase. Josephine's pie money went into a jar she kept hidden in their room marked "Dress Shop" in careful handwriting. 6 months after their wedding, they moved out of the boarding house and into a small cabin on the outskirts of Rico. It wasn't much, just 2 rooms and a loft, but it was theirs. Donovan built furniture in the evenings, a proper table and chairs, a bed frame, shelves for Josephine's growing collection of books. She made curtains and rag rugs, slowly transforming the bare cabin into a home. They were happy in a way that surprised them both. The marriage that had started as a practical solution to an immediate problem had deepened into something profound and unshakable. They learned each other's habits and moods, discovered how to comfort and support each other, found joy in the simple moments of daily life together. "I never imagined I could be this content," Josephine said one evening, as they sat on their small porch watching the sunset behind the mountains. "After I lost my parents and the farm, I thought I'd spend the rest of my life alone, just working to survive. But it's more than I ever dreamed possible." "I feel the same way," Donovan replied, pulling her close against his side. "I spent years drifting from job to job, never really belonging anywhere, but here with you I finally feel like I'm home." Their first real test came in the winter of their first year together. The mine where Donovan worked hit a bad vein, and the owner decided to shut down operations until spring. Donovan was laid off along with most of the other workers, and suddenly their income was cut in half. "We'll be all right," Josephine said firmly when Donovan came home with the news. "We've been saving, and I can increase my pie production. Maybe I can also take in some sewing work. I saw a notice at the general store that Mrs. Wilson is looking for someone to help with alterations." "I'll find other work," Donovan said. "Anything I can get. We're not going to lose everything we've built." He found work doing odd jobs around town, fixing roofs and chopping wood and helping to build a new barn for one of the nearby ranches. The pay wasn't as good as the mine, and the work was sporadic, but it kept them afloat. Josephine took the sewing work and increased her baking, working long hours to make sure they could pay their rent and buy food. It was harder than anything they'd faced before, but they got through it together. On the nights when Donovan came home exhausted and discouraged, Josephine would hold him and remind him of their dreams. When Josephine worked until her fingers cramped and her eyes burned from sewing by lamplight, Donovan would massage her hands and tell her how proud he was of her strength. Spring came eventually, and with it, new opportunities. The mine reopened, and Donovan was hired back immediately. But more than that, a wealthy family from Denver decided to build a summer home just outside of Rico, and they needed someone to manage the construction and then to oversee the property. The job came with a small cabin on the edge of the property and a salary that was twice what the mine had been paying. Donovan accepted it immediately, seeing the opportunity it represented. They moved into the cabin, which was larger and better built than the one they'd been renting. And suddenly they had more breathing room financially than they'd ever had before. "We could start looking for land," Josephine said excitedly one evening. "With what we're saving now, we could afford a down payment on a small ranch within a year, maybe less." But Donovan shook his head. "Not yet. Your dress shop comes first. We agreed when we got married that we'd work toward our dreams together. And you've been waiting longer than I have. It's time to make your dream happen, Josephine." Tears filled Josephine's eyes. "You mean that? You'd really put my dream first?" "Always," Donovan said, taking her hands in his. The scars from her burns had faded to thin white lines across her palms, barely visible now. He traced them gently with his thumbs. "You're my wife and my partner. Your happiness is as important to me as my own, more important, honestly, so yes, we're going to get you that dress shop." They found a small storefront on Main Street that had been sitting empty for months. The owner was willing to rent it cheaply, and Donovan used his carpentry skills to build display cases and a counter and shelves for fabric and notions. Josephine used all her savings to buy her first stock of materials, beautiful bolts of fabric in every color imaginable, lace and ribbons and buttons. The day Josephine opened her dress shop was one of the proudest of Donovan's life. He stood beside her as she unlocked the door for the first time, watched her face light up with joy and accomplishment, and knew that everything they'd been through had been worth it for this moment. The shop was immediately successful. Josephine's talent with a needle was matched by her eye for color and design, and women came from all over the region to order dresses and have alterations done. Within 6 months, she was busy enough that she had to hire an assistant, a young woman named Clara who was learning the trade. "I did it," Josephine said to Donovan one evening, wonder in her voice. "I actually did it. I have my own business, something that's mine and can't be taken away." "You absolutely did," Donovan agreed, pulling her into his arms. "And I'm so damn proud of you I could burst." 2 years after they'd married, Donovan finally had enough saved for a down payment on land. He found a beautiful piece of property about 5 miles outside of Rico, 50 acres of grazing land with a creek running through it, and a stand of aspen trees that turned gold in the fall. The current owner was an elderly rancher looking to downsize, and he was willing to carry the note himself, which made the purchase possible. Donovan built them a house on the land, a real house with 4 bedrooms and a proper kitchen and a parlor with windows that looked out over the mountains. Josephine cried when she saw it finished, overwhelmed by the beauty and the solid reality of it. "This is ours?" she asked, walking through the rooms with wondering eyes. "Really and truly ours?" "Really and truly," Donovan confirmed. "Every board and nail. I built it for you, for us, for the family we're going to have here." They moved into the house in the spring, and Josephine continued to run her dress shop in town, making the drive each day in the buggy Donovan had bought for her. He started building his herd, buying a few cattle at a time, good breeding stock that would form the foundation of a proper ranch. Their first child was born the following winter, a healthy baby boy they named Daniel. Donovan held his son for the first time with shaking hands, overcome by the weight of the tiny life cradled in his arms. This was everything he'd ever wanted, more than he'd ever dared to dream possible. "He's perfect," Josephine whispered from the bed, exhausted but glowing with happiness. "Just like his father." "He's lucky to have you as his mother," Donovan replied, carefully placing the baby in her arms. "You're the strongest, bravest woman I've ever known." Daniel was followed 2 years later by a daughter they named Margaret, and then 2 years after that by another son, William. The house filled with the sounds of children laughing and playing, with the chaos and joy of family life. Josephine scaled back her hours at the dress shop but kept it running with Clara's help, and Donovan built his ranch into something substantial and profitable. They worked hard, both of them, but they also made time for each other and for their children. Summer evenings were spent on the porch watching the sunset. Winter nights were spent gathered around the fireplace telling stories and playing games. They built traditions and memories, created a life rich with love and meaning. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Donovan took Josephine back to Rico, to the boarding house where they'd first met. Mrs. Henderson had retired and moved in with her daughter in Denver, but the new owners let them visit for a few minutes. "Do you remember?" Donovan asked as they stood in what had been the kitchen. "You were standing right there when I came in, your hands burned, looking so scared and brave at the same time." "I remember thinking you were the most handsome man I'd ever seen," Josephine admitted with a laugh. "Even through the pain and the terror, I noticed that. And then you were so gentle with me, so kind. I started falling in love with you right then, I think, even though I didn't realize it yet." "I knew," Donovan said. "I knew the moment I started bandaging your hands that you were going to be important to me. I just didn't realize how important, didn't understand that you'd become the center of my whole world." "Best kitchen fire that ever happened," Josephine said, and they both laughed at the absurdity of it. They walked through town hand in hand, visiting the general store where Josephine had lost her job all those years ago, passing by what had been her dress shop before she'd sold it to Clara when the children came along. So much had changed, and yet the love between them had only grown stronger and deeper. "If you could go back," Donovan asked as they drove home in their wagon, "if you could change what happened that day in the kitchen, would you?" "Never," Josephine said immediately. "Not for anything. Those burns brought you into my life, led to everything we have now. I'd go through that pain 100 times over if it meant I got to have you and our children and this life we've built." "Me too," Donovan agreed, "though I'd prefer not to see you hurt again if we can avoid it." They laughed together, and Donovan thought about how far they'd come, from strangers brought together by accident and pain to partners in every sense of the word. They'd built a marriage based on trust and respect and genuine affection, and that foundation had only strengthened over time. The years continued to pass, marked by milestones both large and small. Daniel grew into a strong young man who loved ranching as much as his father did. Margaret inherited her mother's talent with a needle and her business sense. William became a teacher, moving to Denver but visiting often. Donovan and Josephine grew older together, their hair going gray, their bodies bearing the marks of years of hard work. But they still held hands on the porch in the evenings, still made each other laugh with remembered jokes and shared memories. On their 30th anniversary, their children and grandchildren gathered at the ranch for a celebration. The house was full of noise and love. 3 generations of family that existed because a cowboy had run into a burning kitchen to help a stranger. "Tell us the story again," Margaret's oldest daughter begged, "about how you and Grandpa met." Josephine looked at Donovan, and he nodded encouragingly. This was her story as much as his, and she told it better anyway. "Well," Josephine began, settling into her chair with her granddaughter on her lap. "It was a hot afternoon in June, and I was making lunch in the boarding house kitchen. I'd been having a terrible day already, everything going wrong, and then the worst thing happened. The oil in my pan caught fire, and when I tried to move it, I spilled burning oil all over my hands." The children gasped dramatically, as they did every time they heard this part, and Josephine smiled. "I screamed, and the fire spread to the curtains, and I thought for sure the whole building was going to burn down with me in it. But then your grandfather came running in like a hero from one of those dime novels. He put out the fire and took care of my burns, and he was so gentle and kind that I knew right then he was special. And then he cooked for you because you couldn't use your hands," one of the boys added, proud of knowing the story. "That's right," Josephine confirmed. "He cooked for me, and he helped me with everything I couldn't do for myself. He took care of me when I had nobody else, when I was scared and hurt and didn't know what I was going to do, and then he asked me to marry him even though we'd only known each other a week." "That's so romantic," Margaret sighed, though she'd heard the story 100 times before. "It was terrifying," Josephine corrected with a laugh, "but it was also the best decision I ever made. Your grandfather gave me a home and a family and a life better than anything I'd imagined, and all because he was brave enough to run into a burning kitchen to help a stranger." "And you were brave enough to say yes when I asked you to marry me," Donovan added, reaching over to take her hand. The white scars on her palms had faded even more over the years, barely visible now unless you knew to look for them. But Donovan always knew where they were, always remembered the day they'd been made. That evening, after the children and grandchildren had gone home or to bed in the various guest rooms, Donovan and Josephine sat together on their porch watching the stars come out over the mountains. "We did all right, didn't we?" Josephine said softly. "Better than all right," Donovan replied. "We built something real and lasting. We raised good children who are raising good children of their own. We've had a good life, Josephine. The best life." "It's not over yet," Josephine pointed out. "We've got plenty of years left." "I know," Donovan said, "and I plan to spend every single one of them loving you." They sat in comfortable silence, 2 people who'd found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances and built a love that had weathered every storm. The ranch spread out around them, prosperous and peaceful, a testament to their hard work and partnership. Inside the house, their family slept safe and secure, another generation carrying forward the legacy they'd built. Donovan thought back to that day 30 years ago when he'd dropped a saddle and run toward a scream. He'd had no idea that moment would change his entire life, that the woman with the burned hands would become the center of his world. But he was grateful every day that he'd been there, that he'd been able to help, that Josephine had been brave enough to let him into her life and heart. "What are you thinking about?" Josephine asked. "Just how lucky I am," Donovan replied. "How lucky we both are." "It wasn't luck," Josephine said. It was choice. You chose to help me that day, and I chose to let you. We chose each other every day after that, and we're still choosing each other now. That's not luck. That's love. She was right, as she so often was. Love was a choice they made daily, a commitment renewed with every sunrise and sunset. It was in the small gestures and the grand ones, in the way Donovan still helped Josephine down from the wagon even though she was perfectly capable of managing on her own, in the way Josephine still made his favorite meals even after 30 years of cooking them. The moon rose over the mountains full and bright, casting silver light across the land they'd built together. Donovan pulled Josephine closer, feeling the solid warmth of her against his side, and knew that he would never tire of this moment, this woman, this life. I love you, he said, simple words that carried 3 decades of meaning. I love you too, Josephine replied, always and forever. They stayed there until the night grew cold and the stars wheeled overhead, 2 souls intertwined so completely that it was impossible to say where one ended and the other began. And in the morning they would wake and do it all again, living their love story one day at a time, building their forever one moment after another. The seasons continued their eternal cycle, and Donovan and Josephine moved through them together, their steps slowing but their hands always clasped tight. They watched Daniel take over more of the ranching operations, saw Margaret's dress shop in town flourish under her daughter's management, celebrated William's appointment as school principal in Denver. But more than the achievements and milestones, they treasured the quiet moments. Mornings spent drinking coffee on the porch, evenings reading together by lamplight, lazy Sunday afternoons when the whole family gathered for dinner, the house ringing with laughter and conversation. Do you have any regrets? Donovan asked one day as they walked slowly around their property, following the creek that wound through the aspens. Josephine was quiet for a long moment, and Donovan waited, knowing she was giving the question the serious consideration it deserved. I regret that my parents didn't live to see this, she said finally. I wish they could have known you, could have met their grandchildren. I think they would have loved you and they would have been so proud of everything we've accomplished. But as for my own choices, my own life, no, I have no regrets. Everything I've done, even the mistakes, led me to you and to this life. How could I regret that? I feel the same, Donovan said. Sometimes I think about what would have happened if I hadn't been in Rico that day, if I'd passed through a week earlier or later. We would never have met. You would have gotten help from someone else. I would have gone to work at the mines, and our paths would never have crossed. The thought of that, of living a life without you in it, that's unbearable to me. But it didn't happen that way, Josephine reminded him. You were there exactly when I needed you. And I like to think I was what you needed too. Maybe it was fate, maybe it was just chance. But either way, we found each other. That's what matters. They made it back to the house as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple. Donovan helped Josephine up the porch steps, his hand steady at her elbow, and she smiled at him with the same warmth and love she'd shown him every day for over 3 decades. Inside the house was warm and welcoming, filled with the accumulated memories of a life well lived. Photographs lined the walls, showing the progression of their family over the years. The furniture Donovan had built with his own hands was worn smooth by use and time. Josephine's quilts covered every bed, each one a work of art created with patience and skill. That night, as they lay in bed together in the room they'd shared for so many years, Josephine traced the lines on Donovan's face with gentle fingers. You're still the most handsome man I've ever seen, she said softly. And you're still the most beautiful woman in the world, Donovan replied, meaning every word. They fell asleep wrapped in each other's arms, secure in the knowledge that they would wake up the same way. Tomorrow would bring new joys and new challenges, but they would face them together, as they had faced everything for the past 30 years. And if sometimes Josephine looked down at the faint white scars on her palms and remembered the pain and fear of that long ago afternoon, She also remembered the gentle touch of the cowboy who had bandaged her wounds and changed her life. Those scars were a reminder not of suffering, but of the moment when everything had changed, when love had walked into her life disguised as a stranger with kind eyes and capable hands. She had been burned in a kitchen fire, and a cowboy had bandaged her hands and cooked for her instead. It was such a simple beginning to such an extraordinary love story. But then the best love stories often were. They started with small moments of kindness and grew into something that lasted a lifetime. Something that created ripples extending far beyond the original two people. Donovan and Josephine had found each other in pain and uncertainty, and they had built a life filled with love and purpose and joy. They had worked hard for everything they had, supported each other through every trial, and celebrated each other's triumphs as their own. They had created a family and a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. And through it all, from that first moment when Donovan had carefully wrapped Josephine's burned hands to this quiet evening decades later, the foundation had remained the same. Trust, respect, partnership, love. It was everything Donovan had ever wanted when he dreamed of having roots and a home. It was everything Josephine had hoped for when she dreamed of starting over and building something that couldn't be taken away. Together they had made those dreams reality, and in doing so they had found something even more precious than they'd imagined. They had found each other. The moon rose over the Colorado mountains, casting its silver light over the ranch where Donovan O'Brien and Josephine Darrow O'Brien slept peacefully in each other's arms, their love story complete and perfect in every way that mattered. From strangers to partners to soulmates, they had walked the journey together, and they would continue walking it hand in hand for all the days remaining to them. It was a love born from an accident, from pain and fire and desperation, but it had become something beautiful and enduring. It had become the kind of love that people told stories about, the kind that inspired and gave hope. And it had all started with a simple act of kindness, with a cowboy who saw someone in need and chose to help, and a woman who was brave enough to accept that help and see where it might lead. In the end, that was the greatest gift either of them had ever received, the one thing that made all the difference. They had been given the chance to love and be loved in return, fully and completely without reservation or condition, and they had taken that chance and turned it into a lifetime of happiness.